Okay, welcome to the online version of Finance 4923, International Financial Management. I am Haoyang Xiong. I know it's kind of a hard situation for all of us to continue study this course for the rest of this semester. I do apologize if there's something wrong with this video or anything else. Before we start, I'd like to say a few words about all the changes and our plans for the rest of this semester. I already sent out 2 emails explaining all the changes. Apparently, we're gonna cancel all the quizzes, and as well as this third test, which means that we're gonna have one last test at the end of April. And you can find all the details in those 2 emails. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Send me emails or anything like that. I do hope that we can continue learn this course through these online format. So let's get started. So last class, when we say last class, it was like 3 weeks ago. We started chapter 10, which is the measure of exposure to exchange rate fluctuations. So this is a kind of very interesting topic. So we talked about how transaction exposure can be measured and how economic exposure can be measured. And we identified 3 forms of exchange rate exposure. The first we have is transaction exposure, and we covered most all of that. And the second is economic exposure. We're gonna talk about the economic exposure in this video. As I said, we're gonna forget about the translation exposure, which means that that's not gonna be on the test. So a quick review of the transaction exposure. So transaction exposure is the sensitivity of the firm's contractual transactions in foreign currencies to exchange rate movements. So we only focus on the contractual transactions. Here is the example of the consolidated net cash flow assessment. And this is the first way of measuring the transaction exposure. We use the standard deviation to proxy or measure the transaction exposure. Like I said, we can understand the transaction exposure as the risk. So apparently the standard deviation is a good example of how to measure risk. So we use standard deviation to measure the transaction exposure. So here is a formula. So we have the W, which is the proportion of portfolio value in currency X or Y, and this and here we have the standard deviation of percentage changes. Remember, we talked about percentage changes in currency value X or Y, and the last term CORR, the correlation, which is the correlation coefficient of percentage changes in currencies X and Y. This is how to measure the currency correlations. I also gave you an example of how to calculate the standard deviation of the portfolio. You can go back to look at your notes. So today we're going to pick up from here. We're going to talk about another way of measuring the transaction exposure, which is the value at risk, and we also call it VAR. So VAR is simply a measure of the potential maximum 1/4 loss or other time periods on the value of positions of an MNC that is exposed to exchange rate movements. Here is the formula of the VAR. The maximum 1 period, here we have 1/4, 1 period loss is simply just the expected value minus 1.65 times the standard deviation of the foreign currency. So the reason why we use this formula is that, for example, if all these quarterly percentage changes are normally distributed, so then recall what you have learned in your statistics class. The maximum 1/4 loss is determined by the lower boundary of the probability distribution. For example, if we have a 95% confidence level, the maximum loss is about 1.65 standard deviations away from the mean. So we use 1.65 times the standard deviation and subtract it from the mean. So that's how we calculate the maximum 1/4 loss. So here is an example. Assume Miami Co only needs to worry about its transaction exposure to Mexican peso net cash flows. So it can use the VAR method to estimate the maximum expected loss. We assume Miami estimates the standard deviation of quarterly percentage changes of Mexican peso to be 6%. If these quarterly percentage changes are normally distributed, then under 95% confidence level, the maximum loss is determined by the lower boundary, which is about 1.65 standard deviation away from the mean. Assume the Mexican peso will depreciate by 1%. So how do we calculate the VAR? So here we use the maximum 1/4 loss, which is the VAR, equals the expected value minus 1.65 times the standard deviation of the percentage change of Mexican peso. So here, the Mexican peso will depreciate by 1%, and then the expected value is negative 1% minus 1.65 times the standard deviation, which is 6%, and that gives us negative 10.9%. So how do we understand this? How do we interpret this number? It means that the maximum 1/4 loss is going to be 10.9% under the 95 confidence level. So this is how you calculate the VAR. So on the test, I might ask you to actually calculate the VAR. So all you need to do is plug in the numbers and give me the final answer of the VAR. So next, the factors that can affect the maximum 1/4 loss or the VAR. Apparently, the first factor is the expected percentage change, right? This is first term. So this is the first value or the first factor, and then the confidence level used. Like I said, if we use 95%, so this number should be 1.65. Actually, this is the z-score, if you recall what you have learned in your statistics class. So this is simply just this one is simply just the z-score, one tail z-score. And of course, the third factor that can affect the VAR is the standard deviation of the quarterly percentage changes in the currency. Or we can also calculate the maximum 1/4 loss of a portfolio. The same thing here. This one does not change. And if we use the same confidence level, this one does not change as well. So only thing changed is here, the standard deviation. We're going to use the standard deviation of the portfolio instead of the standard deviation of the single currency. So we plug in the numbers and we have the maximum 1/4 loss, which will be negative 7.47%. So this is how we calculate the VAR for the portfolio. So the limitations of the VAR, the first limitation is that if the distribution of exchange rate movements is not normal, then the estimate of the maximum expected loss is subject to error. And the second limitation is that if the exchange rate movements are not stable, then we cannot use the VAR method to actually calculate the transaction exposure. So the next major type of exposure is the economic exposure. So what does economic exposure mean? It means the sensitivity of the firm's cash flows to exchange rate movements, and this type of exposure can often refer to as operating exposure. So remember here, economic exposure talks about all the cash flows to the exchange rate movements. Remember, the transaction exposure only focuses on the contractual cash flows. So we can say that the transaction exposure is a subset of the economic exposure. So this table shows us how economic exposure to exchange rate fluctuate, how economic exposure changes to the exchange rate fluctuations. So on the first 4 columns, we have the sources of U.S. firm dollar cash inflows, and the first column, the first row, we have the local sales, and the second row we have the U.S. firm's exports denominated in dollars, and then the third row we have the firm's exports denominated in foreign currency, and the last one is the interest received from foreign investments. And these are all the cash inflows for a U.S. firm. And the last 3 rows, we have the sources of U.S. dollar outflows. The first one we have is firms imported supplies denominated in dollars. And we have the firm's imported supplies denominated in foreign currency. And also we have the interest owed on foreign funds borrowed. And these two columns represent the change of foreign currency, the change of the foreign currencies. On this second column, we have the currency depreciation, and on the third column, we have the currency appreciation. And we're going to determine how economic exposure changes to the exchange rate fluctuations. So the impact of depreciation in the foreign currency on the U.S. firm cash inflows and outflows is shown on the second column. So overall, no matter the the cash inflows and cash outflows, they're gonna decrease. They're gonna be decreased if the foreign currency depreciates, and they're gonna increase if the foreign currency appreciates. So we're gonna explain it. We're gonna explain the depreciations first. So assume that the foreign currency depreciates. Of course, the local sales would decrease, because as a result, if the foreign currency depreciates, it means that the foreign products will be cheaper for the American consumers. So American consumers will buy more products from foreign countries. So as a result, local sales, the domestic sales, will be decreased. And of course, the U.S. firm's exports will be decreased as well. The same logic, because the foreign products are going to be cheaper. So as a result, the U.S. firm's exports will go down. And the U.S. firm's interest received from foreign investments will decrease as well, because the foreign currency is cheaper. When you convert the foreign currency into U.S. dollars, you're gonna have fewer U.S. dollars. So the interest received will be decreased as well. So then we're gonna evaluate the dollar cash outflows. So we're gonna ignore the imported supplies denominated in dollars. We're gonna focus on the imported supplies denominated in foreign currency. So why the firm's imported supplies denominated in foreign currency will decrease? Somebody might ask that you talked about this before. If the foreign currency depreciates, the U.S. customers, they're going to buy more products from foreign currency. So the firm's imported, so the firm's cash outflow should increase instead of decrease. That is true, but here we have a very important assumption. The assumption is that the U.S. firm's imported supplies, remember here we talked about supplies, and the supplies are unchanged. So this is the very important assumption. We assume that the amount of supplies imported by the U.S. firms will be unchanged. So on the other hand, if the amount of the supplies imported are unchanged, but let's take a look at here. If the foreign currency depreciates, which means that the cost of import will be lower, right? For example, if a firm buys buys supplies from China, and if the Chinese yuan depreciates, so the product is going to be cheaper. For example, if the U.S. firm buys a certain amount of supplies, then the overall cost will be lower. As a result, the total cash outflows will be decreased, right? That decrease represents the overall cost of the import will be decreased. So that's why we say the cash outflows will be decreased. So the same logic here, the interest owed on foreign funds borrowed will be decreased as well, because the same logic, the foreign currency will be depreciated, so the cost of borrowing will be lower, and then the total cash outflow will be decreased. So if you can understand the impact of foreign currency depreciation and the impact of foreign currency appreciation will be the opposite of the depreciation. So if we have foreign currency appreciation, all the cash inflows and outflows will be increased. So here is simply just a summary of what we have talked about in the previous table. So if we have a depreciation in the foreign currency, that's going to cause a reduction in both cash inflows and outflows for the U.S. firms. Again, if we have foreign currency depreciation, then the products will be cheaper, and which means that the products of the U.S. firms will be more expensive, so people will buy less products, will buy fewer products from the U.S. firms. Then the cash inflows will be reduced. And on the other hand, if we have a depreciation in foreign currency, then the overall cost of the supplies imported will be cheaper for the U.S. firms. As a result, the overall cash outflows will be reduced as well. Again, if we have appreciation in the foreign currency, then that's going to cause an increase in both cash inflows and outflows for the U.S. firms. So here, if we have foreign currency appreciation, then the foreign products will be more expensive. So people will buy more products from the U.S. firms. As a result, the cash inflows will be increased. And also, the cost of supplies imported from foreign countries will be increased. As a result, the cash outflows will be increased as well. So here are the mechanism of how economic exposure reacts to the foreign currency depreciation and appreciation. So the preceding discussion suggests that the MNCs should be able to determine how their cash inflows or outflows in general would be affected by the exchange rate movements. So however, the MNCs, they want to conduct a more thorough assessment of their economic exposure. They prefer to know precisely how their net cash flows would be affected as a result of specific exchange rate scenarios. So one method of doing this is to set up a spreadsheet showing the MNC's primary sources of cash inflows or outflows. So we're going to use a table to actually calculate or evaluate how the economic exposures change according to the foreign currency movements. So for example, we have a US business. We have a firm that conducts both US business and Canadian business. So the sales for the US business is $320 US, or the 320 million US dollars. And the Canadian business is 4 million Canadian dollars. And they also have the cost of materials, which will be 50 million US dollars and 200 million Canadian dollars respectively. And they also have the operating expenses, interest expenses, and cash flows. So the Madison company, which is the US-based MNC, they want to know how they want to assess its economic exposure. So here's a table showing different exchange rate scenario and also the economic exposure to the different exchange rate scenario. On the first column, we have the first exchange rate. For example, if 1 Canadian dollar is equal to 0.75 US dollars. On the second row, if 1 Canadian dollar is equal to 0.80 US dollars. And on the third row, if 1 Canadian dollar is equal to 0.85 US dollars. According to the different exchange rate scenario, we're going to evaluate how the economic exposures are going to change. So for example, if we look at the first exchange rate scenario, remember the US sales is 320 million US dollars, and the Canadian sales will be the Canadian sales is 4 million Canadian dollars, and we convert that into US dollars. 4 times 0.75, that gives us $3 million in Canadian sales, and the total sales will be 323 million US dollars. And here are the costs. The US cost of materials is $50 million, and the Canadian cost of materials are 200 million Canadian dollars, and when we convert that into US dollars, that's gonna be 150 million US dollars. So the total cost of the materials in US dollars will be $200 million. Sorry for that. And the last one we have is the interest expenses. The US interest expenses are 3 million US dollars, and the Canadian interest expenses are 10 million Canadian dollars. We convert that into US dollars, that's going to be 7.5 million US dollars. The total interest expenses in US dollars are going to be 10.5 million US dollars. So we can actually calculate the cash flows in US dollars before taxes. So first we have the total sales, which is 323 million US dollars, and minus the total cost of materials in US dollars, which is 200 million US dollars, and minus the operating expenses, which is 60, and minus the total interest expenses in US dollars, which is 10.5, and what we get is 52.5 million US dollars. So that is the cash flows in US dollars before taxes. So if, for example, the Canadian dollars appreciates against the US dollars, so here 1 Canadian dollar is equal to 0.80 US dollars. So in this case, we do the same calculation, and what we can see here is that the total cash flow in US dollars before taxes will be 42.2 million US dollars, and that is going to be lower than the first scenario, which is 52.5 million US dollars. And if the Canadian dollars keep appreciates, for example, if we have the third scenario, in this case, the 1 Canadian dollar is equal to 0.85 US dollars. So what we have for the cash flows in US dollars before taxes is going to be 31.9 million US dollars. So this shows us that if the foreign exchange rate appreciates, as a result, the cash inflow, here is the cash inflow, is going to increase, and the cash outflows here is going to increase as well. So the cash outflows is going to increase as well, but the overall net cash flows will be reduced, because that's the overall, or the net cash flows, it really depends is really dependent on the magnitude of the cash inflows and the cash outflows. So in this case, we can see that the cash inflows only increased by 0.4 million US dollars. But we can see here the cash outflows are increased by 20 million US dollars. So that's why the overall cash flows will be decreased. I believe this is everything for Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is just an introduction of how to measure the different types of exposures. We talked about the transaction exposure and also the economic exposure. So in Chapter 11, we're gonna focus on the transaction exposure. We're gonna talk about how to manage the transaction exposure. So again, if you have any question, feel free to email me. So we're gonna stop here for today.